Yeah, we're good to go.
Uh, Navia, we seem to have lost all our attendees.
Oh, no, they're coming in.
Okay, interesting. Welcome, everyone. We'll just give it a minute for people who are attending to log in. Okay, wonderful. So I'd like to welcome everyone to today's session of the Conversations on South Asia series. The series is hosted by faculty in the South Asian Studies Collective here at Dartmouth College, each of whom select books published during the past 2 years for us to discuss and reflect on. My name is Kirk Gambetta. I am the faculty coordinator for this year's conversation series, as well as a postdoctoral fellow in the Society of Fellows and a lecturer in art history. The South Asian Studies Collective is very excited today to be hosting a conversation about Douglas Ober's new book, Dust on the Throne: The Search for Buddhism in Modern India, published in 2023 by Stanford University Press and Navayana Publishing in India. Following introductions by Professor Reiko Onuma from the Department of Religion, Douglas Ober will begin by presenting his book, after which Christopher Queen and Vigita will provide their responses. So before proceeding with today's book conversation, I want to make a few announcements and acknowledgments. First, I want to make everyone aware of our Winter Conversation series. On January 16th, we will be hosting a conversation about Sudev Shet's book, Bankrolling Empire: Family Fortunes and Political Transformation in Mughal India. On January 30th, we will discuss Martin Saxer's new book, Places and Knots: Remoteness and Connectivity in the Himalayas. And finally, on February 27th, we will turn to Sri Rupa Roy's new book, The Political Outsider: Curative Democracy and the Lineages of Populism. And please note that we will be shifting to Thursdays at 12:15 p.m. instead of Tuesdays for our regular programming, as we have done in the past. So again, we'll be moving to Thursdays at the same time. And do look for sign-up information in our email correspondence on our website and social media accounts when we post this information in December. Secondly, I would like to thank our sponsors for this event, the Department of Asian Societies, Cultures, and Languages, and the Bodhis Fund for South Asian Programming at Dartmouth. Thank you as well to our two Bodhis student fellows, Navya Bharadwaj and Mritila Sarvanan, for helping organize today's conversation. Lastly, thank you to Hope Rennie and the Department of Asian Societies, Cultures, and Languages for all of her help with the series. One overall reminder to webinar attendees: please leave your comments in the Q&A box, not the chat, and I'll try to remind everyone later when we enter the open discussion. I would like to now briefly introduce Reiko Onuma, our moderator for today's conversation. Dr. Onuma is Robert 1932 and Barbara Black Professor of Religion here at Dartmouth. She's the author of 3 books, including most recently, Unfortunate Destiny: Animals in the Indian Buddhist Imagination, from 2017. So with that, I will let Reiko introduce today's participants.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. So my name is Reiko Onuma, and I teach in the religion department here at Dartmouth. I'll be serving as the moderator for this event. I do want to make sure we have as much time as possible for discussion, so I'm going to very briefly introduce the author and the book, as well as our two discussants. Once I'm done with the introductions, we'll first hear from the author and then each of the discussants in turn, with each person speaking for maybe 10 to 12 minutes. And then once all 3 presentations are over, we'll give the author a chance to respond to anything the discussants have brought up. And then hopefully, if there's time, we will open the floor to your questions. If you're in the audience and you'd like to ask a question, please be prepared to use the Q&A box on the screen, and I will relay those questions to the author. So our author for today is Douglas Ober, who is currently serving as a lecturer in history at Fort Lewis College. He's also an honorary research associate at the Center for India and South Asia Research at the University of British Columbia. His book is called Dust on the Throne: The Search for Buddhism in Modern India, co-published by Stanford University Press and Navayana Press in 2023. In this book, Ober sets out to refute the long-standing scholarly truism that Buddhism all but disappeared from India by the 13th or 14th centuries and was not revived until the birth of Ambedkarite Buddhism in 1956. In contrast to this standard historical narrative, Ober uses a very broad array of phenomena from the British colonial and early post-colonial periods to show that there was, in fact, such a thing as modern Indian Buddhism long before 1956. However, modern Indian Buddhism in these periods has been overlooked, or in his terms, unarchived, perhaps because it was less a matter of demographic numbers and more a matter of the widespread appeal of Buddhism among modern Indians and the use of Buddhism for a variety of different religious, social, political, and rhetorical purposes. I enjoyed this book very much. I am the one who suggested it for this series. It is impressively researched and draws on a wealth of archival materials, and its excellence was recently recognized when it was shortlisted for the Kundil History Prize in 2024. After we hear from Douglas, we'll then hear brief remarks on the book from our two discussants. The first discussant will be V. Geeta, who is a longtime feminist activist in India, working on issues related to caste, gender, education, and civil rights. She also serves as the editorial director of Tara Books, based in Chennai. And then our second discussant will be Christopher Queen, who is now retired, but formerly served as a lecturer in religion and as the Dean of Continuing Education at Harvard University. He's also a scholar well known for his many publications on socially engaged Buddhism. So with that, I will go ahead and turn things over to our author, Douglas Ober, who will offer some introductory remarks on the book.
All right. Well, first, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone and just express my gratitude to Dartmouth's Department of Asian Societies, Cultures, and Languages, as well as the Bodhis Family South Asia Programming Funds, just for bringing us all together and supporting today's event. As someone who's organized a lot of events in the past, I recognize all the vision and work that it goes into making conversations like this possible. I also want to give a special thanks to Kurt and Navia and Mritila for organizing today's event and handling kind of all the behind the scenes logistics. I'm sure things that we're not even aware of up here on screen. I'd also like to recognize Reiko for bringing my book to the attention of the collective, as well as Christopher and Geeta, who have joined us today to share their thoughts and critiques. So as I kind of understand it, I have about 10 to 12 minutes to share a kind of brief overview of the book. And what I'll do during that time is just really focus on the book's core arguments, what I understand to be its key contributions, its own limitations, and then some areas where I think there's room for further exploration. My hope is that by providing that broad overview, it'll provide those who haven't read the book with a sense of the book's structure, its purpose, its broader implications. Okay. So at its most general level, Dust on the Throne, The Search for Buddhism in Modern India addresses the revival of Buddhism in modern India, specifically from the early 1800s up through the 1950s. And in studying this period, my book also challenges us to think more deeply about the much longer history of Buddhism in South Asia and its relationship to other regions across Asia, as well as other religious traditions, particularly in the case of Brahmanism or Hinduism, however we'd like to kind of parse that ism. The questions that it raises are meant to encourage a critical look at how we, in fields like South Asian history, Buddhist studies, Hindu studies, have often approached Buddhism's history and legacy in the subcontinent. The structure of the book is quite straightforward. So in addition to an introduction and conclusion, there are 7 main chapters, each of which tackles a distinct but interrelated theme. Each of these chapters is arranged mostly in chronological order. So my hope in doing that was to allow readers to kind of trace the progression of Buddhism in India over time, again, specifically from the 1800s onwards. I should add that the early chapters also dwell at much greater length on the kind of early and longer history of Buddhist and Brahmanic relations in South Asia, going back some 2,000 years. Now, central to the book are 4 main arguments that I believe add a kind of fresh perspective to those of us who work in the fields of South Asian and Buddhist studies. So the first argument, as Reiko mentioned, challenges this widely accepted theory that Buddhism essentially disappeared or all but disappeared from the subcontinent sometime between the 10th to 14th centuries, and then it was not revived until the 1950s with B.R. Ambedkar's conversion to Buddhism in 1956. And what I argue instead is that this language of Buddhism's death or disappearance is actually a little more than a useful fiction, a kind of modern myth, a shorthand that many scholars use to conveniently simplify a much more complex and dynamic history, and often a history that for some individuals might be a kind of unpleasant history to actually dwell upon. Now, rather than vanishing in its entirety by the 14th century, I argue that Buddhism suffered a slow and gradual decline in the centuries thereafter and was essentially pushed to the fringes of the subcontinent as it lost the patronage of merchants and ruling elites. In effect, by the 1500s, the only places where Buddhist institutions like a Sangha continued to operate were in the high Himalaya, in the Kathmandu Valley, in the Chittagonian Hills, in what today is southeastern Bangladesh, and perhaps in some select locales in southern India. We have some empirical evidence that suggests the presence of Buddhist viharas, monasteries, still active up until the mid 1500s to early 1600s. Now, part of the reason why I think this history is so often ignored is not for kind of lack of empirical evidence, as I just mentioned, but more to do with our interpretive models. And some of these interpretive models have to do with this question of how we define religion and therefore define Buddhism, questions of what constitutes authentic or inauthentic Buddhism. But there's also kind of another interpretive model that anachronistically conflates ancient India with the modern day nation state. For instance, the Buddhism of Chittagong is not seen as Indian, it's seen as Bangladeshi, or the Buddhism of Newars and Kathmandu is not seen as Indian, it's seen as Nepali. But these are, of course, just modern projections of the nation state into the past. But I also believe that our focus on Buddhism's disappearance or decline has also led us away from thinking about what remained of Buddhism in the popular Indian imagination and the imagination of Brahmanical elites in particular. What I argue is that when you look at those manuscripts, myths, folk tales, temple art, and so on, that was still kind of conversant and being circulated in the 1500s and 1600s, you discover that while Buddhism may have disappeared in a sense of identity in an institutional sense in the interiors of India, it continued to shape Indian place worlds. That is, it informed how South Asians understood themselves, either as kind of good Hindus or good Brahmins in relationship to this kind of Buddhist, Buddhist identity. But contrary to what many might suspect, the memory of Buddhism was largely an antagonistic one in which Buddhists and the Buddha were remembered by Hindus, if we choose to use that term at this time, as Nastikas, as kind of troublesome misfits, as deniers, as wily rogues who upset the Dharmic order as imagined by Brahmins. And it's from that memory that a new imagining of Buddhism begins to emerge in the early 1800s. And that really takes us to the second major argument of the book, which is that Buddhism's revival in colonial India was not just a product of the European discovery or invention of Buddhism, as many books have called it. Instead, I see Indian and Asian figures as instrumental in this revival, as actively participating in the recovery of India's Buddhist past and in the reimagining and revitalization of a modern Buddhist thought and practice. To piggyback off of Donald Lopez's famous expression, I think Indians were as much the curators of the Buddha as their European counterparts were. There's a famous book, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, called The Curators of the Buddha, an edited collection by Donald Lopez. Now, in short, I don't think any of this should really come as a shock to most of us. The idea of restoring agency to South Asian actors themselves. But we're still often taught that Western Orientalists were responsible for bringing Buddhism solely into focus. And there is no doubt that the Orientalist enterprise was central to Buddhism's rediscovery, but our almost singular focus on it has often come at the expense of ignoring the contributions of different regional scholars in India and beyond. And I think this is particularly the case in India, where you had a large number of Western-educated Indian elites who were Anglophones, whose scholarship being reproduced in English could help often reach European and American audiences on both sides of the Atlantic, right? So it really shaped the way this kind of colonial understanding of Buddhism unraveled. And in several chapters of the book, I spend a considerable amount of time showcasing the contributions of several Indian scholars, figures like Rajendra Lal Mitra, who was the first Indian president of the Asiatic Society, Sarat Chandra Das, a very renowned Bengali explorer, spy, and scholar of Tibetan Buddhism, among many others. And I also reflect on how we can make sense of the huge number of subaltern laboring castes who did much of the physical labor excavating Buddhist sites. That is, on the one hand, we have the interpretations of Buddhism being put forth by kind of elite South Asian scholars. But on the ground, we also know that there were thousands of different what we, for lack of a better word, we could call subaltern castes who were doing the physical labor, and we don't really understand how they understood these stories that they were being told. And the resources are often difficult to kind of really get a sense of that. That now takes us to the kind of third major argument of the book, which is that India's modern Buddhist revival did not begin with Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's conversion to Buddhism in 1956, nor did it begin with the founding of the Mahabodhi Society in 1891. In both of these events, Ambedkar's conversion and Anagarika Dhammapala's founding of the Mahabodhi Society are often seen by many scholars as launching the beginnings of an active Buddhist discourse in India. Now, it has to be acknowledged that Ambedkar's conversion, was arguably perhaps as great as the sum of all these other parts in terms of its lasting legacy today in India. But even our focus on Ambedkar has tended to obscure this much broader and older Buddhist movement in India that began roughly a century earlier. And that movement, in my view, really paved the way for Ambedkar's own actions. I'm not really certain that we can understand Ambedkar in his entirety without understanding this wider historical Buddhist scene in which he was raised for most of his life. So finally, this takes us to the last argument, and one that really serves as the basis of each chapter of the book, which is that Buddhism's colonial revival was not some marginal or incidental development, as it's sometimes portrayed, but a really significant historical force. It had profound implications for India's social, intellectual, and political landscape, particularly in shaping debates on caste, religion, nation, ethics, social justice, and beyond. And each of the book's 7 chapters explores a different facet of this influence. So I'll kind of just briefly walk us through a kind of Cliff Notes version of what each chapter kind of focuses on, and then I'll add a few kind of final comments and end it there. So the first chapter explores how Buddhism was remembered by South Asians on the eve of British colonialism. The second chapter delves into colonial era educational systems and how new Indian elites, really meaning those Indians with bi or trilingual skills and Western education, use their interest in Buddhism to popularize Buddhism via private and public channels. So through the creation of scholarly societies, publications of magazines, creation of plays with Buddhist themes, novels with Buddhist themes, books, and so on. Chapter 3 explores what I call banyan tree Buddhism, which refers to kind of the transnational and translocal flows of Buddhists across India, both as part of pilgrimage networks to newly restored ancient Buddhist sites and as parts of dozens of new urban Buddhist associations that were organizing Buddhist events and really served as hubs for Buddhist activity for kind of Buddhists coming from outside of India. In that chapter, I focus on some of the more well-known Buddhist organizations like the Mahabodhi Society, as well as quasi-Buddhist ones like the Theosophical Society, but also lesser-known groups like the Bengal Buddhist Association, established in Calcutta, and the Shakya Buddhist Society, established in Madras. So chapters 4 and 5 then explore how Buddhism became central to both Dalit conversion movements and anti-caste critiques. In the decades before Ambedkar's conversion, there were numerous of these different kind of, so-called low caste and Dalit conversion movements to Buddhism in the half century before Ambedkar's conversion. And at the same time that these were unfolding, you begin to see the emergence of Hindu nationalist groups and leaders arguing that Buddhism was a so-called branch of Hinduism. And the Buddha, as they put it, was born, lived, and died a Hindu. And I kind of argue that this was an attempt by Hindutva-inspired leaders to contain and define Buddhism by supporting Buddhist institutions and building quasi-Buddhist temples, particularly through the figure of J.K. Birla, the well-known Indian philanthropist, part of the Birla family, who built over 15 Buddhist temples in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. Chapter 6 looks at how Buddhist thought was integrated into Marxist discourses and how Marxism shaped radical Buddhist thought from Russia, Tibet, China, Sri Lanka, and India. And finally, the last chapter explores how Buddhism became a diplomatic tool, a form of soft power politics in India's post-colonial foreign policy and part of national heritage celebrations at home. So I'll kind of close here in a few moments with a few reflections on, the book's limitations, but also tell you a little bit about the sources for the book, right? Kind of what forms the basis of all this scholarship. So to write the book, I visited over 30 archives, temples, and museums across South Asia, primarily in India, Nepal, Myanmar, and Sri Lanka. So some of these sites included major archives like the National Archives in Delhi, Colombo, and Yangon. Others were locations that were far less commonly visited, so small libraries and collections in lesser-known temples. And this allowed me to access a wide range of unstudied archival materials in multiple languages. Most of the sources that I used in their primary kind of unedited or untranslated form were in Hindi, Tibetan, and English. But I also kind of drew on as a total about 15 different source languages in total. So again, working with translations or edited works from those bodies of language. The diversity of the sites I visited was also reflected in the sources themselves. So in addition to looking at historical newspapers, journals, and memoirs, I examined intelligence reports, state gazetteers, wall paintings, temple art, a variety of different mediums. And of course, I can't take credit for doing all this work on my own. In many ways, it was a deeply collaborative project, and I worked and relied upon a lot of other scholars. It's one of the reasons if you open up the book, you'll see the acknowledgement section just kind of teeters on and on and on and on, because I need to acknowledge my debts in that sense. And on the one hand, I see my archival kind of contributions as central, but I also see my own analysis of kind of well-studied documents as something that's novel, of trying to offer an alternative lens through which to see a familiar history. And Reiko has given me a cue that I'm running too late here. So, I'll just kind of close by saying that, the book does have many shortcomings, particularly in my lack of broader linguistic skills. And I think that's somewhere where there's ample opportunity for new scholarship to be conducted and looking at other kind of linguistic communities across the subcontinent and their kind of own articulations of Buddhism. But there's certainly much more I could share, but perhaps we'll cover some of this in the discussion. So let me just end by expressing my sincere thanks once and all to all of you for joining me here.
Thank you, Douglas. Sorry to be the taskmaster here with my timekeeping. I am timing your remarks, so if you get to be about 12, 14 minutes, I will send you a little message in the chat. So now we'll hear from our first discussant, which is V. Geeta.
Thanks very much, Kurt, and the conversation series organizers for this opportunity to share my views on Douglas's book. I'm actually quite excited to be here with three people whose work I've only known through the printed page thus far. Years ago, I read Engaged Buddhism, and I was very excited by the perspectives that it opened up for some of us here. And I remember writing a short paraphrase of the introduction. So thank you, Dr. Queen, for that book. And that little paraphrase is there in the Tamil language now. And Reiko, I read your book while I was working on my Ambedkar project and learned a lot from your work on bodily self-sacrifice in the Buddhist traditions. And before Doug's book was published, I read his dissertation. So it's quite interesting for me that these three texts that I've been looking at for the past 6 to 7 years are now incarnate in some ways. So nice meeting you all. So I want to start off by taking note of Ober's expansive canvas, basically the entire subcontinent, so to speak, and his plotting the contours of a Buddhist world across his expanse, and dipping occasionally into Southeast Asia as well. While I was aware of the work undertaken by Dharmapala to an extent, and of the so-called Buddhist revival in Madras, the work of Pandit Ayotidas and P. Lakshmi Narasu, and of course of Ambedkar's relationship to Buddhism, reading Ober also showed me how I might want to parse some of these things that I was familiar with, put these voices in conversation with others. So for instance, Ayotidas in conversation with Bodhanand, for example, or Lakshmi Narasu in conversation with Kripa Saran. I was also fascinated by the account of the Hindu right, of those individuals and organizations that sought to reread the relationship between, as Doug pointed out, Buddha and the Brahmins of the Hindu Mahasabha, but also of that extremely interesting, somewhat shadowy historical figure, Jugal Kishore Birla, who was tasked with building some of these viharas in the 1930s and 40s, and of marginal figures like Nambiar. And in all of their imaginings of the Buddha and Buddhism, the Buddha emerges as an earnest Hindu reformist. And you also see that he's being claimed for a defense of what is assumed to be an essentially Catholic Hindu civilization. So there's a kind of a sliding between what is Hindu and what is Buddhist, and a move that's fairly characteristic of a range of writers from Vivekananda onwards to several others who are not as well known. So this was quite interesting to see them all as part of a landscape, part of a very complex and contentious conversation around Buddhism. And as interesting as these were the regional and vernacular shapings of Buddhism and the Buddha, and Douglas just told us the number of archives that he visited and the range of languages that he had to access, I was somewhat aware of how the vernacular archive can look since I know a bit about Pandit Ayodhyadas and his texts, but it was instructive to know of work undertaken in the Hindi language, for example, from Shiv Prasad, the educator and researcher, to Bodhanand, from Sankrityayan to Narendra Deva, a range of voices in Hindi, for example. And in this context, I found a chapter on socialism and Buddhism particularly interesting. And I'll explain why in a moment. One, of course, is the attempt by both Dharmananda Kosambi and Rahul Sankrityayan to locate, if you will, Buddhism within a world historical framework by aligning it in a very complex sort of manner to socialism. And what I found fascinating was that the book points out how their views emerge from two interlinked contexts. One was their very situated location. Both of them thinkers who wrote and shared their views in their respective languages in the main. Kosambi wrote more or less only in Marathi, and Sankrityayan to a large extent mostly in Hindi. But these men were also wanderers in other worlds. Literally, they wandered the subcontinent and beyond, and imaginatively, and in an existential sense too, they were parivrajakaas, moving through diverse social contexts and life worlds. So you have their situatedness on the one hand as writers in the vernacular domain, and their eagerness to create a map of a Buddhist cosmopolis, no less, through their research and political thought. And to me, it seemed that their efforts appear constitutive of Buddhism as such, what I understand to be a kind of a hybrid universalism. I hesitate to call it modern because you see such hybridity, say, even in a 4th century text like the Tamil epic Manimehalai as well. Be that as it may, I found it interesting that this hybrid universalism plays out in interesting ways throughout the book. And in fact, Ober takes us through this play in each of his chapters, as he's just told us. So I think the book for me was very important because it allows us to contemplate and to unpack this hybrid universalism for what it tells us about Buddhist placemaking and meaning making in the modern period. So let me just explain, drawing on Pandit Ayodhyadas' writings. The book has an entire large section devoted to his work. So on the one hand, he followed developments in various Buddhist geographies, and in his weekly Tamilan featured news as to what transpired by way of Buddhist scholarship or organizing in various places. Places as diverse as Japan, Vietnam, South Africa, Ireland, Burma. He also referenced now and then the new Western interest in Buddhism. And this map of where Buddhism was very important for him because he had converted with hundreds of Dalits to Buddhism in 1891. Of course, he didn't consider this a conversion, but as a reversion to what he held to be the former religion of the Tamil Parayas. So in this sense, to locate the act of conversion within this world map was a significant commemoration of the Dalit past, as well as their being part of this Buddhist cosmopolis. This was very important for him. At the same time, Tas claimed the Buddha for a distinctive Tamil universe, and in two ways. The first was through his magisterial life of the Buddha, Adi Vedam, in which, in addition to extensive citations from the Pali canon, with paragraphs from the Dhammapada transliterated into Tamil, but also he cites a range of Tamil literary texts, some of which are well known, and some of which were recondite even in his time. In her remarkable book on the Tamil Shaivite poet Ramalinga Swami or Vallalar, Shrilata Raman, who teaches in the University of Toronto, has traced a partial genealogy of Ayodhya's thought, especially the manner in which he glosses the term Maitri as Jiva Karunya. And she points to how this term has a long existence in certain kinds of dissident Shaivite texts. And she argues that Ayodhya has reworked its meanings within a recognizably Buddhist context. So for me, it's very interesting the manner in which Tas worked with Pali, worked with Tamil. And apart from this, we find him doing something else as well. In Adi Vedam, he appropriates all scripture from the Old and New Testaments, Puranic literature, and aspects of Islam to a Buddhist purpose. So you have him reconciling Moses, Jesus, Krishna, and the Prophet to the Buddha, to argue that their essential teachings are actually the Buddha's teachings, and that these were originally available in the Tamil language. So this fantastic reconstruction of Buddha's life, which at one level follows the canonical text, but another level locates the Buddha within a very distinctive Tamil semantic literary universe, leavened by the Pali canon. This to me is quite fascinating. And secondly, Tas also produced rereadings of crucial Tamil seasonal festivals, some associated with temples, others with the lunar cycle, creating, to quote the Tamil scholar Stalin Rajangam, a veritable hermeneutics of customary practices, taking his cue from the work of Tamil grammarians and lexicographers. So Tas's movement between his situatedness as a Tamil scholar and as a Siddha doctor, and his gesture towards a wider Buddhist cosmopolis, highlights for me a certain productive tension between the vernacular and other universes which animates Douglas's text. And it is this, in terms of both narrative and argument, I think, which enables Ober to make his case for the persistence of Buddhism, for Buddhist memory in the subcontinent. So if you sort of index the sites, the texts, the persons, and the arguments which reveal to us the persistence of Buddha's memory, you will notice as you read the book that each of these pertains to a certain geography, to a particular language, and to very specific monuments. So interestingly enough, this movement between Buddhism's situatedness and its cosmopolitan expressions is mirrored even in the two, if not contrasting examples that Ober discusses, both of which sought to make Buddhism live, so to speak, in the present. Ambedkar's conversion to Buddhism and Jawaharlal Nehru's adoption of Buddhist diplomacy. On the face of it, it might appear that these are entirely modern secular interventions, though I think there's a lot of debate about how one might read Ambedkar's conversion. But what is evident is that either intervention is subtended by a certain particularity. So if you take Ambedkar, he sought to annihilate caste and untouchability in and through what appeared to him a distinctive civilizational move through the modality of conversion to Buddhism. And he argued his case for the historicity of this move. Buddhism in the past, he noted in his unfinished book, Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Ancient India. And he follows a fairly standard historiographical position here, made prominent at that time by K.P. Jaiswal, by Haraprasad Shastri, that Buddhism in the past was revolutionary and that it was disappeared, so to speak, in an epistemological sense by the Brahmanical counter-revolution and a state formation that heeded Brahmanical lawmaking and Brahmanical morality. in order that the revolutionary promises implicit in the modern democratic movement, which to Ambedkar held the possibilities of a society sustained by liberty, equality, and fraternity, in order that the revolutionary promises of this moment was not likewise swallowed by a counter-revolutionary present, he desired to reinstate the Buddha's creed, his Dhamma. In fact, Ambedkar wanted to write a book length, a study called The Present Age is the Age of Counter-Revolution, which he never did, unfortunately. But it would appear from his jottings and his references to this theme elsewhere that he held not just the Hindu right, but Gandhi's own intervention and with regard to questions of caste and untouchability and of non-violence. He saw in these the shape of a counter-revolution. So I think his choice of Buddhism and his historicist arguments for his choice point to the manner in which he wanted to be part of this very specific history. At the same time, for Ambedkar, it was important to characterize Buddhism as a world pathway. It was not just Indian history that showed him the way, rather it was a creed that was of world historical importance, only it was seldom viewed as such. This was the burden of his addresses in the international Buddhist conferences that he attended. He sought to make a case for its relevance in a world that appeared drawn to either nationalism or socialism or both. It was imperative for him then that Buddhism was viewed for what it could offer those that appeared to be swayed by socialism, for instance, or by the nation state. And this Buddhism, he felt, could offer a way of life and a politics that went beyond private property and the law of contract, as he put it. Nehru's strategy was less fraught and was of a part with his cultural statecraft, as Ober shows us, and in this sense, it was seamless with a certain imagining of India's past. Buddhism was a fit envoy for modern India. And in adopting the symbols of Buddhism, Nehru's modern Indian state sought to transcend its constitutive divisions of caste, of faith, of class, and of languages. And at the same time, it positioned India as being the pivot of Asian unity. And this, perhaps we might want to keep in mind, was done in the context of the Chinese Revolution and an Asia that was threatening to turn red. So Ober's work is rich and layered in that it allows us to think of a place for Buddhism, however you imagine this place, to echo Anne Monniers' felicitous term. A place for Buddhism at the moment of nationalism and the birth of the nation state, and that these need not be the only structures within which one might think of Buddhism, whether it's Nehru's project or the nationalist socialist projects of modern Burma or of Ceylon, or Sri Lanka as it is known now. And to imagine Buddhism as possible elsewhere, in other places, in other sites. So in taking us through that entire genealogy and pointing to the sheer audacity of this endeavor, whether it was undertaken by Bodhanand or by Ayotidas, this movement between Pali Sanskrit and Marathi Hindi, between Pali and Tamil via English, or for that matter, the conversations between the vernacular worlds of Bhakti and the textual universe of the Pali canon. And finally, between the anguished and powerful critique of inequality that Ambedkar advanced and his equally strong invocation of the Dhamma. So each of these endeavors was undertaken in and through a journey across languages, times, and places, between a certain situatedness and a certain utopic imagination. Thank you, Douglas Ober, for writing this marvelous book.
Thank you, Geeta. Now we will hear some comments from Christopher Queen. You're muted. Christopher, you're muted.
Sam, so please, thank you, Kurt and Reiko, for helping to put together this discussion. Doug is right. It's not easy to organize something like this, but it's amazing to read a book that has kind of transformed one's outlook and then be able to be in a conversation with the author so soon after reading it. And it's great to meet Doug in this context and to be able to make a few brief remarks. Geeta mentioned the book that Sally King and I put together in 1996, in which I said that Buddhist modernism basically began on May 25th, 1880, when Alcott and Blavatsky arrived in Colombo and declared themselves to be Buddhists. They took upon Sheila and supported the debates with the Methodist missionaries there and launched Buddhist modernism. So, having read Doug's book, now I feel ashamed of having said that and so many other things because I think this book really creates, Gita called it an expansive canvas. It's a whole new landscape within which to view the work that so many of us are doing. And I just want to mention very briefly what a kind of renaissance of, well, maybe not a renaissance, but an explosion of Ambedkar studies is going on right now. Probably you're most aware of Akash Rathor's five-volume collection that came out in 21, B.R. Ambedkar, The Quest for Justice, involving 60 scholars exploring Ambedkar's legacy. In 22, Nadim Khan's translation of Maisab Ambedkar's powerful memoir, Baba Sahib, My Life with Dr. Ambedkar. Scott Stroud's work, fascinating work, his major book, which just came out, The Evolution of Pragmatism in India, Ambedkar, Dewey, and the Rhetoric of Reconstruction, but also Scott's very interesting postings, Roundtable India Online, how do we know what Ambedkar read? And he's taken his phone and he has taken pictures of Ambedkar's books and the jottings, the marginal jottings and underlinings and so on. And I'm kind of proud that Scott followed the time that I spent in the Siddharth Library in Mumbai doing that thing, but I had to copy out everything by hand because I didn't have a smartphone or a camera or a copier in that kind of very primitive library, but it was Ambedkar's own library, and I was in the presence of his own books, and to be able to almost imagine why he was crossing out certain things and highlighting other things that would end up being in the Buddha and his Dhamma, his posthumous work. So Scott Stroud's work is great. Ashok Gopal's major biography, Apart, The Life and Thought of B.R. Ambedkar, which came out this year as well. And finally, the first volume of Akash Rathor's Becoming Baba Sahib, Birth to Mahad, which came out over the summer. So we expect a couple of more volumes of that. And there have been a number of major conferences in the last few years on Ambedkar studies, and this wonderful new journal sponsored by Brandeis University, CAST, Global Journal of Social Exclusion, which has many articles looking at Buddhist revival and many, many other subjects and so on. But I just wondered as I read Doug's book, how many of these scholars had had a chance to study it closely and now to have read it twice. In my case, although I hadn't really intended to. We had a flood in our house, and all my books now are packed up in the barn, including my closely marked book, a copy of Dust on the Throne, which I couldn't access at all. I've reread the book twice now, which is great just for this event. And it was a terrific exercise. I'm sitting here in our guest room because my library is packed away while they rebuild the flooded areas. Hopefully gladly the books weren't damaged, but at any rate. And then I typed out some remarks for this event and then forgot to push save. So I'm just kind of winging it here with my notes. But again, it's a privilege to be a part of this conversation. Reading the book is kind of like I said, kind of like being in a hot air balloon floating over India for 2 centuries with a listening device and a telescope, so you could really tune into what people on pilgrimage sites were saying and what was going on in backyards and so on. But of course, we have satellites that do that kind of thing too. But the specificity, the ability to meet personalities that many of us were not familiar with, Pandit Subhaji Bapu, whose conservative take on the Diamond Sutra was early in the book, and Rajendra Mitra and his struggle with the racist James Ferguson, and Mahavir Singh, the wrestler turned monk, who was really the mentor to Bhikkhu Chandramani, who who presided over the Great Diksha in 1956. These are people that I really was not aware of. And then to look closely at Nehru at the end and see to compare the nature of his take on Buddhist revival with that of Ambedkar was a wonderful way to end the book, and um, the implications for Indian nationalism, and the way in which all of the developments, the slow and gradual and accumulating developments that Doug talks about throughout the book, in a way result in some very odd things, reaching out to China, for example, and trying to protect the borders through the exchange of relics and all kinds of things like that, that shed a light on what some of us thought was a pretty simple revival of Buddhism all at once, whether in 1956 or when Ambedkar first read Kaluskar's Marathi biography of the Buddha. So it's just a terrific opening of possibilities. And as you say, Doug, because of the language issues that we all struggle with, we don't read Marathi, we don't read Malayalam, all these things, that others can pick up where you have the many, many threads that you have left for people to explore. So that's a terrific thing. History really is made of personalities. And I just wanted to mention that, my first trip to India was in 1986, and I went initially just to visit Sanchi and Sarnath and Bodh Gaya and Ajanta. But just before I left, I went to a slideshow, which was a fundraiser for the TBMSG British Buddhists who were doing such work, keeping Ambedkar's tradition alive and also working with the Dalit peoples. And I asked who could I contact to learn more about this. And the organizer said, well, call Eleanor Zelliot out in Minnesota, and she will give you some names and addresses, which is exactly what happened. I ended up sleeping on a couch in Wasant Moon's apartment in Bandra East as he was, editing the complete writings and speeches of Ambedkar. Got to know him well. He took me out to Nagpur and showed me his own library, which had 4 divisions: A for Ambedkar, B for Buddhism, C for caste, and D for Dalit. He had collected tremendous amount of periodicals, and it was an archive. I don't know, Doug, whether you visited the Vasant Moon archive. It's a private archive out in Nagpur. But anyway, it was full of great stuff. But in the process, because of contacts that I made through Eleanor, I was able to meet several of the associates of Dr. Ambedkar himself. Nanak Chand Ratu, who was his personal assistant, who was very old, but was kind enough to meet and talk with me. Waman Godboli, who was the one who insisted that the Diksha take place in Nagpur and not in Mumbai. Maisab Ambedkar, who was not only clinging to her Buddhist faith, but the intimacy of her memories of her husband in those 9 years that they were together. And finally, Vasant Moon himself, who was a young man among the tough guys who would protect Babasaheb Ambedkar in his speaking tours by, threatening to beat up anybody who would get too close to him. And he ended up being, of course, a great editor. So these personalities come alive in Doug's book, people that we hadn't, heard about. As I mentioned, Babu, Mitra, Mahavir Singh, these people really form important chapters in this story, which goes back farther than we thought. I really appreciated early on in the book, Doug, your highlighting of the so-called unarchived histories, the marginalized, ignored, disenfranchised sources, but also the people that those sources represent. And I mean, I felt that you were in a way expressing the spirit of Buddhist revival insofar as it represented a counter-revolution against the dominance of caste and all of the suffering that represents, and that trying to look behind the mainstream stories for the hidden stories, the stories of those who would never otherwise be heard was a wonderful thing that you did in the book. Also, just quoting here, there may be visual, oral, literary accounts to help guide our reading of these materials, the how, what, when, and where of history, but our ability to truly grasp the world in which they dwelled is to a large degree guided by human imagination. And the more that imagination is informed, the more sophisticated our understanding can be. And of course, anybody that attempts to write historically realizes that. I remember when I joined a writing group myself a few years ago, it was a memoir group, and I started remembering very early memories, and I sent a couple of my drafts to my sister, and she said, that's not how it happened at all. It's completely different. And I started realizing that our memories are subject to imagination and all kinds of other distortions, which aren't necessarily bad, but we do the best we can with the materials that we have. And I feel that the verisimilitude that breathes through your prose, your lucid prose, is terrific. And we can hope that your sincerity and your attention to detail really does reflect what actually was going on, not only on the ground in these locations. Time, space, and imagination all begin to create a new and vivid history, which is what you've done for us. You mentioned at the end that you felt badly about not being able to present women's voices. And I think everyone, men and women who attempt to write about ancient, medieval, or even modern history, share that sense of regret. But I just wanted to mention an article that I recently published in the Caste Journal called Reading Dalit Autobiographies in English, and 10 top picks. 3 or 4 of the top picks in that article in the Caste Journal, Reading Dalit Autobiographies, are by women. And in fact, one book in particular, Urmila Pawar's book, which she co-edited with Amun's wife, Meenakshi Moon, is called We Also Made History, Women in the Ambedkarite Movement. And there are other autobiographies like Baby Kamble's The Prisons We Broke, and Urmila Pawar's own autobiography, The Weave of My Life. These make wonderful reading, and of course they are within the scope of contemporary lives, but nevertheless they point to the experience of women within the Ambedkar movement in ways that we have not had access to before, and make for a wonderful, and since they're in English, they're accessible to many of us. I wanted to just end my brief remarks by adverting to the book, Doug, that you mentioned, which I think was kind of a mind blower for all of us when it first came out too, Lopez's Curators of the Buddha. And in fact, Don came to the Harvard Buddhist Studies Forum and presented the essence of his book, some of the highlights. Charles Hallisey was there because he had a very good chapter in that, which you actually cite in your book, and so on. But and I spoke up and said, one of the things that really bothered me a little bit about his book, though, is the implication that Western scholars are somewhat mercenary in their efforts to uncover and to explain and to reveal what's really going on in Asia, in the Orientalism, essentially. And in fact, the example of that in the book that I thought was really striking is the citation of Rudyard Kipling's novel Kim, in which a Tibetan monk is seeking a magic river in South India and stops off at the museum in Lahore, which in fact Kipling's son was the curator of that museum. And there's an encounter in which the monk, the traveling monk, and the curator have a very nice exchange. And the curator shows him all the things they have collected from Tibetan lamaseries and so on, and the monk is impressed with that. And at the end of the conversation, the old monk gives the curator a painted pencil box with pencils in it, pens in it, that he can put in his collection. And he's very grateful. The curator's grateful. And he says, and in exchange, I would like to give you these eyeglasses here because I see you squinting quite a bit to see the collection, and these glasses will help you see better. And I can get another pair from London in a couple of weeks. And the monk put them on, and it revealed with clarity the things that were right there. And so that all of that is kind of a wonderful story in Kipling's novel, except for the fact that the commentator says this just typifies what happens over and over again when Western scholars go in and attempt to give their own eyeglasses to local commentators, local pundits, local Buddhists, or what have you, so that they can clearly see their own history and that they can see it through our lenses. And I said to Don Lopez at the time, do you really think that's what always happens when we white guys, go to India to try to understand what's going on, and we sit at the feet of new friends and try to listen carefully and write down what they say or take a picture with our phone? Of course, we didn't have smartphones when this came out, but still. And I don't remember exactly what he said, but I mean, I think that this post-colonialist, anti-Orientalist frame of mind almost ruled out that people like yourself, Doug, and many others who go to India with tremendous sense of humility to learn something and to try to understand what those whose ancestors brought this to life and uncovered can mean for us. And that we, even though we may have a bibliography of 30 pages in the back of the book and footnotes that are just as exciting to read for me as was the text itself, that the overall purpose of such a book is to try to understand what was experienced by those who are testifying on our behalf. So I think that the book will continue to cause people to look back at their own work and take a closer look at what more needs to be said to describe the origins of Buddhist modernism, for example, and to get beyond Anagarika Dharmapala and even Ambedkar, who has become kind of an obsession in my own work, but to realize that Ambedkar was standing on the shoulders of so many others, male and female, through the years, and that this book, more than any other, I think, has encouraged me, and I hope others, to go back and to work harder to reconstruct what really went on over the past couple of 100 years. So thank you so much for this contribution.
Thank you, Christopher. So at this point, I'd like to invite Douglas to respond to anything that the discussants have said, but also I'd like to invite the audience, if you have questions, to please use the Q&A box, which I will be monitoring. So Douglas, is there any comments that you wanted to make?
Sure. I mean, I can certainly find something to say if need be. I guess first, I can't see Geeta on my screen anymore. I'm not sure if she's still present or not. She is here. Okay, just weren't showing up. But thank you, Geeta, for your comments and reflections. And it's a pleasure to finally see you in person and as close as we can be in the flesh. But I guess one of the main things that I'd just like to respond to it, and it's really just to some degree an affirmation of what I see you kind of pulling and extracting from my book, is this kind of tension that you notice between the universal and the vernacular. And I like this expression that you kind of termed here, hybrid universalism, and the way in which there is this wandering that continues to permeate through all of these figures. And I think to some degree that may also reflect my own archival interests and my own research interests, where at an early stage in the kind of research process, I made a concerted decision to not just write a kind of localized history. And initially I went into it with the expectation that I would just write a kind of intellectual biography of one or perhaps two different figures. And then I started to recognize that my fear was that if I wrote something that was just specific to one individual, it would get kind of pushed aside as being another marginal, incidental instance of an Indian figure engaged in Buddhism. And I decided that we had to write a kind of subcontinental history, right? Even recognizing the limitations that it would have, again, due to my kind of linguistic skills or lack thereof. But I think that this tension between the universal and the local is very evident throughout almost all of these figures. You know, as you mentioned, Tass is drawing from pools of thought that are coming from across the globe and that are also deeply steeped in kind of local Tamil traditions. But ultimately, to some degree, the way I kind of read his project, if you will, is it's one that is localized. It's one that's conceived at this regional, local project of kind of the question of caste and caste oppression. The same way that I look at someone like Kripacharan, and Kripacharan is also traveling and drawing from, Anglophone schools of thought. He's engaging with Pali language material, with Bengali language material. But ultimately, in the end, even as he's networking with these other groups, his primary concern seems to be these divisions that exist within the Nikayas, these monastic divisions within the wider Theravada world. And that's where he kind of puts his energies. Dharmapala, we see his quest is for this united Buddhist world, right? Particularly as it's envisioned and laid out in a place like Bodh Gaya, Nehru, to seeing how Buddhism can be utilized for kind of national power politics, which becomes his vision of the local, of the vernacular, is the national, right? As the prime minister. Kosambi to the Maharashtrian publics, and this choice to write almost exclusively in Marathi and not in the other numerous languages in which he was very conversant and could have certainly written in. And I think to some degree we can almost see this history unfold as different ideologies take place. I mean, there certainly is this universal and vernacular tension that can go far back when. And then as this ideology of nationalism and the kind of the budding of the nation state begins to really take root in the late 19th and early 20th century, I often see the universal and the vernacular being replaced to some degree by the universal and the national, right? There's this desire on the one hand to be part of a wider cosmopolitan global world and community, but you also want to be steeped in the nation, right? This conception of nation never really fades away as we still live with it very much in our 21st century world. And I guess, Christopher, just in response to your comments, and I guess the first thing I jotted down here as you were writing, you said you were ashamed of your work with, the question of when does Buddhist modernism begin? Don't be ashamed, because without your work, I would not be where I am today. It got me to where we are. And I hope in some ways that my book serves as that same purpose, that it's superseded in my own lifetime. I think that would be a great honor to see other people engage with my work and recognize some of my own fault lines and mistakes and blunders that I made. And as they dig deeper, they may very well discover that the narrative I've written isn't really the narrative that best captures this wider dynamic. I guess one of the only other kind of things, I'll mention is, this question of the way the book has been, to some degree, been received in India, which for me has been honestly probably one of the most rewarding parts of writing this book. And I have to give almost all that credit to Nabayana Publishing and S. Anand and Alex George, the kind of editors who worked on this book for me, because the way that they've helped kind of publicize and disseminate the awareness of the book in South Asian and the wider South Asian world has just been tremendous. I've received so much feedback from receiving emails from individuals in Pakistan who are writing me and saying that was actually my great grandfather who was that excavator on the ground. And we have photographs of him, but we didn't actually have this other part of the story and didn't have that wider narrative. The book has also been kind of well received in places like Thailand, where there have been Thai language reviews of it that I've had to ask some of my Thai colleagues and friends to translate them for me. So it's just been really lovely to see the way that the book's themes, but also the kind of detail that I attempted to try to provide in the book speaks to different audiences on the ground in India, which, makes the whole research process a rewarding one, to have that kind of gravitas in that sense.
So at this point, I'd like to invite anyone in the audience to submit questions in the Q&A box. I don't see any right now. Maybe while we're waiting. Oh, wait. There might be one. Yes. Oh, this is from Doug Haynes here at Dartmouth. He says, I am interested in how the idea of Buddhism's disappearance took hold, and I particularly wonder whether the forms of Buddhist knowledge that your book examines fit within colonial sociology. I am not sure my thinking on this issue is clear, but my impression is much of your book, though not all, discusses figures involved in intellectual exploration rather than those involved in attempting to shape religious political communities. And perhaps to a certain extent, explorations under colonialism were guided by notions that the development of religious political communities was an essential aspect of religious change. As a whole, I wonder how Buddhism was recognized in the census and other forms of colonial knowledge, and wonder if our impression of a disappearance stems from the fact that Buddhist intellectual activity did not fit neatly within these systems of knowledge because it did not acquire the same significance in processes of religious conflict and community formation.
I think that's a fantastic question. That question is one that I attempt to address really in the first 100 pages or so of the book. I will also say that it's the one place in the book where I've also seemed to have created the most criticism and critical response to my book from many different scholars who've kind of written me either personally or written some reviews, kind of criticizing that argument that I make. But the broader gist, of how I kind of tried to explain this theory around the disappearance of India, as I briefly alluded to in my presentation, is really along three different lenses. So on the one, there's the question of the empirical evidence. And there is ample empirical evidence of Buddhist communities, of viharas being constructed well after the 1500s, well after the 1400s in various parts of South Asia. And some of this is located in places like Tamil Nadu today. Some of it's located in places like Bihar, to make it correspond to modern day provinces and states. The reasons why I argue that a lot of that evidence has been ignored or kind of suppressed or swept away largely has to do with these two interpretive models. So on the one hand, as I mentioned, this question of the nation state, of projecting the modern day nation state of India into the past. And that has led to, a kind of unarchiving of this history. Again, as I mentioned, you have a continued Buddhist influence in Chittagong. So in colonial times, we would have just described as kind of right on that Bengal borderland world, but today it's part of Bangladesh. And so it doesn't really fit neatly into a kind of conventional Indian nationalist history because it's no longer within those national boundaries. We see these same sorts of debates emerging even at the diplomatic level in India around the question of what the Buddha's national identity is, right? The Buddha was born in Lumbini, and so Nepali nationalists will often declare that he was a Nepali, right? There's even a bumper sticker, I think it's called Buddha was born in Nepal, BWBIN, that you find in the backs of trucks and, tuk-tuks and so forth across Nepal. And so, that to me is a conflation and it's an anachronism to push these national boundaries back into the ancient past. The same goes for the question around of Newar Buddhist practices, where you find Newar communities continuing to use Sanskrit manuscripts well up until the modern day, right? From the Gupta period onwards, well up until the modern day, there's a kind of continued uninterruption of that Buddhist practice, but it doesn't fit into the kind of nationalist narratives that we're, have been born into. And colonial scholars, to some degree, oscillate on that. If you look at a lot of the early 1800s colonial scholars who are studying Newari Buddhism, they in fact will declare very fervently that this is part of a wider Indian Buddhist world. But at some point over the course of the 19th century, this idea of the Indian nation really comes into being with a much more clearly delineated territorial boundary, and Nepal is no longer part of India. The Bengal regions begin to kind of get excised from this. Even in Chittagong, this briefly becomes Bengali Buddhism in the early 1900s. And then, by the time of the 1970s, no one speaks of this as Bengali Buddhism, or they call it Bangladeshi Buddhism, right? And so the different kind of terminology that we use to delineate it shifts. The other interpretive model that I think has posed some problems for us is around this question of what constitutes Buddhism. And in the early 19th century, many of these colonial scholars, ethnographers, Orientalists tended to privilege this very, I would say, kind of sanitized version of what constituted Buddhism. So it had to exist within monastic walls. It often privileged Pali or Sanskrit texts. And those Buddhist communities that even if they self-identified as Buddhist, if they didn't exist within monastic walls, if say they were, for instance, wandering tantrikas, so people like Buddhagupta Natta, the great Siddhanath who lives in the 1600s, they're no longer seen as Buddhist because they engage in meat eating, they're using magic, right? They're engaging in all these things that from the kind of colonial perspective doesn't meet the definitions of what is often considered to be Buddhist. I think to some degree we see that same sort of paradigm occur with early interpretations of Buddhism, of Tibetan Buddhism. It's not called Tibetan Buddhism, it's called Lamaism, which kind of perpetuates this ideology that it's somehow separate from Buddhism. Is it really Buddhism? But it's not, so we call it Lamaism, right? So it kind of gets segmented and partitioned from this wider narrative. I'm not sure if that kind of begins to touch on why I think this disappearance theory becomes so rampant. But it's probably better articulated in the book itself and through a kind of a wide body of evidence.
If I can just jump in very, very quickly, there are two other areas of knowledge which are seldom connected with this question. One is India's maritime history. If that were made central to the way we imagine Buddhism, you'll have a very different map of Buddhism and a greater continuity over the centuries. The second area of the second archive that's not taken as seriously is the missionary archive. Because right from the time that the Jesuits came in from the 16th century onwards, you will see repeatedly references to these Gnostics of whom they are warned. And Ziegenbalg writes a lot about it in his Malabar Heathenism, which is the 18th century text. But you can also trace it to older missionary concerns about non-believers and believers and what their Brahmanical informants tell them. So I think there are those histories are not made germane to discussions around Buddhism either.
Kurt, do we have, Christopher, go ahead.
Yeah, and it's a great topic because your very last footnote in the book on the word Navayana was helpful. I didn't realize that. I didn't think it was coined by Ambedkar, but I didn't know exactly who had used it earlier. So that was a helpful footnote. But insofar as that term is now beginning to be used a lot, including the publisher of your book, Essanand, and so on, I wonder how you, practically speaking as a scholar, we can speak of Buddhisms in the plural as Masatoshi Nagatomi, our guru at Harvard many, many years ago, started speaking of Buddhisms. But at each stage, it is a Navayana in a certain respect. And so as you begin to look at these earlier very narrow views or expanding views, are you comfortable using the term Buddhism throughout? And how does one really practically or methodologically approach that question as a historian?
I think that it's a question that all historians and all scholars of Buddhism grapple with at some level or another, or they're going to be forced to grapple with. To some degree, to take a simplistic answer to this, the approach that I took in the book itself was that if these communities refer to themselves as Buddhists, I'm going to describe them as a Buddhist, because to me, what's important here is the way that they're articulating their identity, regardless of what a kind of outsider like myself or a scholar or interpreter of it. We can still provide our own critiques and analysis and say that perhaps this tells us about the role of Shaiva ideologies in these communities. But if they're still identifying as a Buddhist to some degree, to me, there's something to be said there. And at least that needs to be unpacked and understood why it is that kind of label continues to get used, or why it doesn't get used.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, I think we are out of time, but thank you so much, Douglas, for this stimulating discussion. Thank you, Geeta and Christopher. And I don't know, Kurt, if you have any closing words to say.
I just wanted to thank everyone for being here, and also just add that as an architectural historian, the book's topics and histories are also of interest, because the idea of a kind of Buddhist past in the colonial period was also formative to what would later become, histories of architectural modernity and architectural modernism in the 20th century, not only in the colonial period, but I think even in envisioning what a kind of post-colonial architecture could look like. So I actually think that there are implications to the book that, in very interesting ways, actually go beyond, concerns within religious studies. So I also really enjoyed this conversation. So thank you all for being with us. Thank you, Reiko, for moderating today's session.
Yeah, thank all of you so much for your thoughts and criticisms. Thank you.
A pleasure to meet you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Nice to see all of you.
Yeah.